This is part one of the video lecture, The Historical Development of the Church. This video is for the course Theology 2 at the East Asia School of Theology. Today, I'd like to begin by asking you a few questions. What is the church like in your home country? For example, which denominations are popular or common in your home country? And how do Christians live and practice their faith in your home country? The reason why I'm asking you these questions is because today Christianity is truly a global religion. And everywhere you travel in the world, you can find Christianity. And Christianity takes many different forms in many different cultures, societies, and nations. And so this means that Christians practice Christianity in different ways throughout the world. And the global nature of this church is actually the result of 2,000 years of expansion, conflict, and theological development. So today we are going to look at church history. We're going to take a rather brief look at church history, and we're going to look at different periods in church history. And by looking at these different periods of church history, this should help us to gain a deeper appreciation for the reasons behind the structural features of today's church around the world, as well as a deeper understanding of how our present day forms of Christianity developed in the ways they did. Now, church history covers a lot of ground, and it's very challenging to summarize 2,000 years of church history in a single lecture. So this lecture actually only scratches the surface of church history. There is a lot more church history out there. And if you are interested in learning more about church history, then I would encourage you to take the church history courses that are offered at East if you have not already done so. You can also learn more about church history by reading about different periods in church history on your own. And I do want to encourage you to do that, because there is so much that we can learn from church history that can help us here and now within our own ministries. So in today's video lecture, we're going to divide church history into 4 different parts. First, we will look at Paul's ministry. Then we will look at the apostolic church. In the third part, we'll look at the post-apostolic church. And then we will look at the post-Reformation church. So those are 4 different periods of church history that we will be looking at today to see what we can learn about the church. So let's begin by looking at Paul's ministry. So we're going to start at the beginning, and we're going to look at the developments that took place during the early New Testament era of the church, starting with some general observations about Paul and his ministry of outreach and church planting. Now, I want to encourage you to pause this video for a couple of minutes right now, and I want you to think about what principles you see in Paul's ministry. You may even want to write down what you see as key characteristics of Paul's ministry. So please take a couple of minutes to pause this video and think about what you see as being the main characteristics or principles of Paul's ministry. Now that you've taken a few moments to consider what principles you see that characterize Paul's ministry, let's now identify what these characteristics are. So the first characteristic of Paul's ministry is his consecration to God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. We see this in Philippians 3:8, where Paul writes, I consider everything a loss compared to the surpassing greatness of knowing Jesus Christ my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. I consider them rubbish, that I may gain Christ. So here we see that after his conversion, Jesus was at the very center of Paul's life. He dedicated himself entirely to knowing Christ and making Christ known among the nations. Another characteristic of Paul's ministry was his dedication to the task of the Great Commission. For example, in 1 Corinthians 9:19, he wrote, though I am free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. In Acts 9, God called Paul to take the gospel to the Gentiles, and during the rest of his life, Paul remained obedient to that call, and this was his great passion in life. The third characteristic of Paul's ministry was his implementation of a strategy. In Romans 15:20, it says, it has always been my ambition to preach the gospel where Christ was not known, so that I would not be building on someone else's foundation. In many ways, Paul's world was an urbanized world. There were numerous cities throughout the Roman Empire, and these cities were major centers of trade and commerce. And so, because of this reality, Paul focused his mission work on urban centers, because what happened in the cities would eventually filter out to the surrounding countryside and finally out to the hinterlands. Paul also sought out Jews who were living in these cities as part of the diaspora, as well as God-fearers who were Gentiles who were already attracted to the teachings of the Jewish faith. And this is because during the previous centuries, the Jews had spread out throughout a number of different nations and a number of different geographical locations. And so because of this, Judaism was becoming more widely known. And in fact, it had even attracted the interest of certain Gentiles. These Gentiles were known as God-fearers. And so they were very interested in the Jewish message. And so because of this diaspora of Jews living around all over the Roman Empire and indeed beyond, and because of this population of God-fearers, Paul, this influenced Paul's strategy for reaching out to people with the gospel. So whenever he went to a new city, his strategy was to first find a synagogue or even a gathering of Jewish people. And he would begin by preaching the gospel to them, because in his understanding, they were already close to understanding the gospel message. because of their long history of experiencing God. And so Paul then would reach out to the God-fearers, and when the Jews eventually rejected him, as they did in many places, he would then take his gospel to the Gentiles. And Paul also had this pattern of taking the gospel to the Gentiles reflects Paul's passion for taking the gospel to the unreached. He wanted to preach the gospel in places and among people who had never before heard the gospel. He wanted to boldly go where no Christian had gone before. Now, another characteristic of Paul's ministry was careful selection. And we see this in Acts 15:14, which says, "But Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord." So what we see here is that Paul was careful in his choice of his audience, in his choice of his disciples, and in the choice of the leadership of local churches. He was also careful in how he tailored his message to the audience to whom he was speaking. He never watered down the gospel message, but he did try to find ways to better connect the gospel message with the different cultures of his listeners. So sometimes he would try to connect the gospel with Jewish listeners by recalling what God had done during Old Testament times. At other times, he was talking with Greek philosophers, and so he tried to connect with them by using ideas that were already present in their culture that he thought might have similarities to the Christian gospel. So he practiced careful selection. Another characteristic of Paul's ministry was his association. In Acts 20:18, it says, "When they arrived, he, Paul, said to them, 'You know how I have lived the whole time I was with you, from the first day I came into the province of Asia.'" And so what I'm talking about here is the fact that Paul took the time to spend personal time with others, to develop them and to love them, imparting his own life in the process. So he often did discipleship in life upon life, person upon person. So he chose to associate with people in a very personal way. In many ways, just like Jesus associated with his disciples in a very personal way. Another characteristic of Paul's ministry can be found in the principle of impartation. For example, in 1 Thessalonians 2:8, Paul wrote, "We loved you so much that we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well, because you have become so dear to us." Paul gave of himself, he gave of the gospel, and he gave of the Holy Spirit. He poured himself into the lives of these new Christians so that they could be strengthened in the faith and equipped to share the gospel message with others, even after Paul moved on to other cities. And so when I say that he gave of the Holy Spirit, I mean that he gave through the power of the Holy Spirit, that the Holy Spirit equipped him and empowered him to give of himself and to give of the gospel to others. The next characteristic or principle of Paul's ministry was his demonstration of a life of Christian love and ministry. So in 1 Corinthians 11:1, Paul wrote, "Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ." And this is one of the passages where Paul tells his disciples to imitate him just as he imitates Christ. And so this actually is something that we should be willing to tell our own disciples and even our own children. Imitate me, even as I imitate Christ. Now, this means when we challenge people to imitate us as we imitate Christ, that means that we have a great responsibility to actually imitate Christ in our own lives so that we can in turn be an example to others. And the last characteristic of Paul's ministry was delegation. In Acts 14:23, it says, Paul and Barnabas appointed elders for them in each church, and with prayer and fasting committed them to the Lord, in whom they had put their trust. Now, this goes along with that principle of careful selection of local leadership. So Paul gave authority and responsibility to others for their own benefit and development, as well as for the growth and expansion of the church. So he not only chose leaders who would leave the local church after he left, but he also gave them the authority to lead these local churches. And this was an act of great trust on Paul's part, because he was confident that he had trained them well enough that they would now be able to faithfully lead these churches even in Paul's absence. And so he gave them the responsibility to help those under their care to grow and to become mature in their Christian lives. So these are all characteristics of Paul's ministry. Now, let's move on to the development of the organization of the church in the apostolic church period. So these are some different ways that the apostolic church was organized. There were apostles. We see, for example, Ephesians 2:19-22 says, consequently, you are no longer foreigners and aliens, but fellow citizens with God's people and members of God's household, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the chief cornerstone. In him, the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. And in him, you too are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. The apostles, through the power of the Holy Spirit, served as the divine spokesman for God's plan and his teaching after Christ returned to heaven. They commanded an authority that was quite extensive and unhindered, but they still often decided things in council with one another. And we see this reality in Acts 15 with the Jerusalem Council. So during the Jerusalem Council, the apostles joined together, they met together, and they discussed some different issues with each other to decide the direction of the church. We also see a plurality of elders, bishops, and overseers in the apostolic church. For example, it says in Acts 20:17, we read from Miletus, Paul sent to Ephesus for the elders of the church. So early on, it appears that there were a number of male leaders in the church rather than a single head pastor who did all of the teaching and ministering in the local congregation. We also see deacons in the apostolic church. Deacons, this word deacon comes from the Greek word diakonoi, and it means servant. So deacons can be considered servers or servants. And so this office arose within the church, which we today call deacons or sometimes deaconesses. And deacons were to serve the needs of the congregation so that the elders would be freer to teach and preach the word of God. For example, in Acts 6, chapter 6, verses 1-7, we read about how there was conflict between Greek Jews and Hebrew Jews. And they were having conflict about the daily distribution of bread. And so the elders appointed deacons to take care of meeting that need so that the elders could then devote their time to studying the word and preaching the word. And then we also see the development of house churches during the apostolic era. For example, in Romans chapter 16, verses 3-5, Paul writes, "Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus. Greet also the church that meets at their house." It appears that early on, churches met in people's houses rather than in specially built or designated buildings. This changed only after the church became officially recognized by the state and gained wealth and power. So during those first few centuries of Christian history, the Christians met mainly in people's homes. So that was the development of church organization during the apostolic era. Now, let's look at the development of the organization of the church in the post-apostolic era. One of the things that developed in the post-apostolic era was a concern with other doctrines. And these doctrines include the Trinity, Christology, and anthropology. So as time passed, certain types of concerns became more prominent in the church. Challenges from within, like Montanism, for example, and other challenges from outside the church, such as sporadic Roman persecution, produced discussions about things like the Trinity, Christology, and anthropology. But there was little concern for doctrines related to the nature or the structure of the church. Now, we have Ignatius' use of the term Catholic or Catholic, and this happened around AD 115. Now, the word Catholic or Catholic means universal. And so this comes from that phrase in the Bible, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one Lord's Supper, right? Now, Ignatius was the first church leader to use the term Catholic, which means universal. So early on, there was a concern for unity and oneness in the church. This manifested itself in two ways: a concern with unity of doctrine and a concern with unity of lifestyle. So we see these two major concerns of the church at this time: purity of doctrine and purity of Christian life. So let's look at this, how this concern for purity of doctrine played out. We have early church teachers, and early on, the preservers of doctrine were the teachers of doctrine. These teachers taught on the basis of gifting. For example, there were prophets, there were teachers, there were elders, and so forth. And so they taught on the basis of gifting and not on appointment or succession. They were held accountable by the scriptures and by the congregation to which they ministered. For example, we have the incident in Acts 17:11, where the Bereans heard Paul's teaching, and they confirmed his teaching by examining the teachings of the Hebrew scriptures to see whether Paul's teaching was in agreement with what God had said in the past or not. And so in that way, Paul was being held accountable to the Bereans, and the Bereans were holding Paul accountable for his preaching. We also have the rise of the bishop. Because the church wanted to ensure the purity of doctrine, it gradually began to invest more and more authority in a single bishop in each church. By the time of Ignatius of Antioch, around AD 115 or early in the 2nd century, he spoke of one bishop over the elders and deacons in all the churches. But in Rome under Clement, this did not appear to be the case yet. It was not until the time of Tertullian and Irenaeus, late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, that the monarchical episcopate was clearly established. This bishop was to be the standard bearer either for the local church or for a region of churches. There was a shift from an emphasis on gifted people to an emphasis on the conservation of the office. So the office began to become more important than the gifting. In short, there was a shift from leadership being gift-centered to leadership being office-centered. And it was during this time that we also had the development of the apostolic succession. Because there were different sects and leaders like the Montanists, the Gnostics, and the Marcionites that were challenging the Christian church, especially from within, but also from outside via Roman persecution, the church moved quickly toward an apostolic succession in an attempt to guard the authority of the teacher and the safety of the congregation. So what I hope you see here is that this shift from a gift-centered teaching to office-centered authority for teaching, to our modern ears, that may sound like it was not a good thing, but we have to understand that at this time, the church did this as a way to guard the church and the people who were members of these churches against false teachings. So this was related to that concern with the purity of doctrine. Now, we also need to keep in mind that there was really no set canon until the mid to late 4th century. Although the canon was generally recognized by AD 175, throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries, there was still some discussion as to which books were considered to be the true word of God, which were legitimate and which were worth living and dying for. These were still live questions in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And so that is also another reason why there was this shift from gift-centered teaching, gift-centered authority for teaching to office-centered authority for teaching. And all of this helped lead to the rise of Rome. Now, there were a number of different mother churches in early church history. These included Smyrna, Ephesus, Jerusalem, Corinth, Philippi, Thessalonica, and Rome. Over time, certain churches, mostly on the basis of apostolic origin, began to set themselves apart as more prominent than others. And so Rome gradually became more prominent. And one of the reasons why Rome gradually became more prominent was because of the fall of Jerusalem, which occurred in AD 70. Jerusalem was sacked by the Romans in AD 70. And at this time, the Romans also destroyed the temple. And this resulted in a reduction in the importance of Jerusalem within the church. Because prior to this time, many of the apostles lived in Jerusalem. But now, with Jerusalem having been sacked and the temple destroyed, Jerusalem became a less important center of Christianity. We also have the presence of Peter and Paul in Rome. This also helped lead to the rise of Rome as a major center for Christianity. The fact that Peter and Paul spent their last years in Rome helped to elevate the importance of Rome within the church. This became especially true as the Catholic Church began to develop the doctrine of apostolic succession. Now, there was a bishop of Rome named Callistus. Sometimes his name is spelled Calixtus. But Callistus was the bishop from around AD 217 to 222. And he helped develop the office of the papacy. And one of the names for the Pope is Pontifex Maximus. And this is a Latin phrase, and it means literally the great bridge builder. Now, this phrase, Pontifex Maximus, actually was used during ancient Roman times before the birth of Christ. And so during ancient Roman times, the Pontifex Maximus was the supreme or chief priest of Rome, and he was the head of Rome's state religion. And beginning with the reign of Augustus Caesar, the Roman emperors took on the title of Pontifex Maximus. Now, the first recorded use of the term Pontifex Maximus to refer to the Pope occurred in around AD 220, when Tertullian used it during his dispute with Pope Callistus I. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, the title Pontifex Maximus was first assumed by Pope Leo, who was Pope from AD 440 to AD 461. But regardless of when the title Pontifex Maximus began to be used, its usage was another stepping stone in the development of the Catholic doctrine of apostolic succession. Now, we also have the term Episcopus Episcoporum, and this is another phrase, and it means elder of elders. So episcopus means elder, and episcoporum is the plural form of elders. So this phrase means elder of elders. Tertullian is also the source of the first recorded use of the term Episcopus Episcoporum to refer to the Pope. And like the term Pontifex Maximus, Tertullian also used this term during his dispute with Pope Callistus I. Now, Cyprian of Carthage, who lived in early to mid 3rd century, also plays a role in church history. As Peter was among the apostles, so Rome is among the bishops. And this is what Cyprian of Carthage wrote. So the argument was that since Jesus gave primacy to Peter above the other apostles, so has he given primacy to the Bishop of Rome above other bishops. And that ends the first part of this video lecture. So please go to part 2 and let's continue with this lecture on church history.